Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone. If I can please respectfully ask you to take your seats, and we will begin in 15 or 20 seconds. Just don't count. Well, good morning. Welcome to this plenary session 3, which is all about the Summit of the Future. It is called the Summit of the Future, but I feel like it was a long time ago when, even though it was just in September, when the Pact for the Future was finally agreed after a year of incredibly hard work, and I know that many of you were also involved. We have a very distinguished panel that we're going to hear from, and then I will moderate a short discussion with them. I would very much encourage you to participate in that. Please feel free to ask questions, and we will get that underway. Before we do, it is my great privilege and a huge pleasure to invite our keynote speaker for this morning, and that's the former President of Hungary. It's His Excellency János Áder, who is also the chairman of the Blue Planet Foundation. Your Excellency, if you could please come to the podium, and we would like to hear your opening keynote remarks. Thank you.
Hagyjunk akkor 20 másodpercet arra, hogy mindenki a tolmácskészüléket felvegye. I'm speaking Hungarian. I will use my mother tongue. Channel 1 or 2, please. It's operating. ...2018-ban 2 amerikai közgazdász kapta a közgazdasági Nobel-díjat. Egyikük, William Nordhaus, a díj átvételekor rámutatott. Ha a gazdasági működés során okozott negatív externáliákat nem számítjuk be, nullára árazzuk, akkor ezért társadalmi szinten fogunk nagyon magas árat fizetni. Hadd egészítsem ki Nordhaus szavait. Ha a gazdasági működés során okozott negatív externáliákat, azaz vízszennyezést, termőföld degradációt, a biológiai sokféleség csökkenését, az erdők pusztítását, az óceánok túlhalászását, és sajnos a sort még hosszan folytathatnám, nem számítjuk be, nullára árazzuk, akkor ezért társadalmi szinten fogunk nagyon magas árat fizetni. Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim! A világ számos pontján foglalkoznak azzal, hogyan alkalmazhatnánk a fejlődés mérésére a ma általánosan elfogadott GDP helyett pontosabb mutatót. A neves közgazdászok, egyetemek és kutatóintézetek New Yorktól Tokióig, kutatócsoportok az ENSZ-ben, az Európai Unióban, az OECD-ben, a Világbankban foglalkoznak a GDP-n túlmutató monitorrendszer megalkotásával. Az ENSZ az idei Summit of the Future záródokumentumában az Európai Unió a 2023-as stratégiai előrehaladási jelentésében célként tűzte ki egy integrált mérőeszköz kidolgozását. Miért? Mert a GDP ugyan sok fontos dolgot mér, de azt, ami az emberi élet, a jólét és a fenntarthatóság szempontjából releváns, azt nem. Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim! 2015-ben az ENSZ közgyűlése elfogadta a 17 fenntarthatósági célt és a 169 alcélt. külön előadás tárgya lehetne, hogy miként állunk az időarányos teljesítéssel. A szeptemberi New York-i értékelés szerint 15 év helyett több mint 60 évre lenne szükségünk a célok eléréséhez a mostani tempó alapján. De térjünk vissza a GDP-hez. Az ENSZ 248 mutató segítségével külön-külön méri az egyes célokat és alcélokat. Az elmúlt közel 10 év során világossá vált, hogy miközben így ugyan fontos részleteket megtudunk, de a kép nem áll össze. Ez olyan, mintha egy impresszionista képnek csak egy darabkáját láthatnánk. Szép, kifejező, felismerik? Hát nagyon elkötelezett Van Gogh rajongónak kell lenni ahhoz, hogy valaki a darabkákból ezt a képet felismerje. Ahhoz, hogy tudjuk, hogy pontosan hol állunk, merre menjünk, ahhoz, hogy olyan döntéseket hozzunk, amik az életünk és a jólétünk egészére hatnak, hiányzik egy eszköz, egy módszertan, amely támogatni tudja a fenntarthatósági szempontokat integráló megközelítést. A tényekre, adatokra alapozott nemzeti döntéshozatalt. Egy olyan módszertan, ami képes a nemzeti és a regionális sajátosságokat beépíteni, ami figyelembe veszi a kockázati tényezőket, a fejlődési prioritásokat és lehetőségeket. Azaz egyszer rugalmas és standardizált. Tudományos megalapozottságú, ugyanakkor a pragmatikus döntés előkészítést is szolgálja. Készülve a World Science Forumra azon elmélkedtünk, hogy a GDP-n túli gondolkodáshoz
we could contribute to thinking beyond the GDP,
különösen úgy, hogy nálunk is
especially
több kutató
as
és
we have
intézet
several researchers
foglalkozott,
and institutes
ezzel a
working on
kérdéssel.
this issue.
Arra jutottunk,
Well, we came to the
ha három
conclusion
magyarországi műhely
that if
nem tud
three
összefogni,
workshops in Hungary cannot come
ha nem
together to
tudják
work
az itt
together,
dolgozók
if the people
tudásukat
working here
integrálni,
cannot integrate their
akkor hogyan
knowledge,
várhatnánk
how can
ezt
we
el
expect
a
institutes
világ különböző
around the
pontján
world, in
működő
different parts of the world,
intézetektől?
to do so?
Majdnem egy évet
Well, we've
dolgoztunk,
worked for almost
dolgoztak
a year.
kiváló kollégák, kiváló
Excellent
kutatók azon,
researchers, colleagues have worked
hogy
for
ma
almost
önöknek
a
ezt a
year
javaslatot
to present this
bemutathassuk.
proposal to you today.
Miben más ez,
How is it
mint a
different
többi?
from all the others?
Kevesebb
Well,
mutatóval
it uses
dolgozik,
fewer
kb.
indicators,
80-nal,
only about 80.
integrált,
It is integrated,
és országonként
and
adaptálható,
it can be
méghozzá az
adapted to
ottani
each country,
sajátosságokat figyelembe
taking
véve.
into account the specificities of the
Három
country.
önmagukban
Well, we
is
propose
integrált
The
módszertan
combined use
kombinált
of three
alkalmazását
methodologies, which
javasoljuk a
are integrated
fenntarthatósági
in
fordulat
themselves
értelmezéséhez.
to
Itt a képen
interpret the
láthatják ezeket
sustainability pivot, the
a különböző
sustainability
elemeket, ezt a
turnaround.
80
Well, you can
indikátort,
see these 80 indicators
későbbi
here.
előadásokban talán
In
lesz
later
mód és lehetőség
presentations,
ezeknek a
perhaps you'll
részletesebb
have the
kifejtésére.
time to discuss them in more detail.
Ez a három mutató együtt
Together,
alkalmas a
these
termelési
indicators can be
tényezők
used to measure
mennyiségének
the
és
quantity and the
minőségének
quality
mérésére,
of production
és
factors
reális képet
and to
nyújt
provide a
a szélesebb
realistic picture
értelemben vett
of the
jólét
broader
állapotáról.
state of well-being.
Mit jelent
What
az
is
első?
the
Az
first?
SGDP.
SGDP stand for.
Célja, hogy a
The
GDP-ben eddig
purpose is to make
láthatatlan,
visible
sőt, sokszor negatív
the social and
társadalmi és
economic
gazdasági
costs that have
költségeket
hitherto been
láthatóvá tegye.
invisible in GDP,
Megmutatja,
which often
hogy
have
mekkora lenne a
have a
gazdasági
negative sign,
teljesítmény,
to show
ami
the economic
a termék
output
és
that would be
munkapiac,
generated if the
a
balance
pénzügyi
between the
szektor
product
és a
and the labor
finanszírozási
market,
képesség
the
egyensúlya,
financial sector
valamint
and the financing
az ökológiai
ability,
források
and
megőrzése
also the
mellett jönne
preservation
létre,
of ecological
és ami
resources were all
egyúttal
maintained,
biztosítaná a megtermelt javak
while
és
ensuring
szolgáltatások
a fair distribution of the
elosztását.
goods and services.
Ez a számítás
This
méri az
calculation
aktuális
measures
folyamatok
the
eltérését
deviation
az
of current
egyensúlyi szinttől,
processes from this
és az
equilibrium level
eltéréssel
and
korrigálja
corrects the
a
value of the
GDP, a ma
GDP
használatos
by the
GDP értékét.
deviation.
Mit jelent a második?
So what is the
A
second one?
fenntarthatósági
Sustainable
teljesítmény
performance
keret
framework
indikátor.
indicator.
Ez a mutató jól
Well,
nyomon
this
követi a
indicator
természeti
tracks the
erőforrásokkal való
specificities of
gazdálkodás
natural resource
sajátosságait,
management
amik a
that are not
GDP
reflected
mérésében
in
ma
GDP
nem
measures
tükröződnek.
today.
Mit jelent a harmadik?
What is the third one?
A GDP-n túli jóléti mutató,
well-being
a
beyond
társadalmi
GDP
jólét szintjét
indicator.
értelmezi és
It
teszi
interprets and makes
összehasonlíthatóvá
comparable the
az egyes
sustainability
országokban
turnaround in
zajló
each country at
fenntarthatósági
the level of
fordulatot.
social well-being.
Mindegyik
So all
indikátor
these indicators
releváns tudást
provide
nyújt a
relevant
gazdasági
knowledge
és
for
politikai
economic and
döntéshozóknak a
policymakers
beavatkozási
on the
irányokról.
directions of possible
A részleteket
intervention. The details of this
Bartus Gábor,
will be
a
presented to you
Nemzeti
by
Fenntartható
Gábor
Fejlődési
Bartus, who is
Tanács
the Secretary
titkára fogja
General of the
ismertetni.
Hungarian
Bár olyan nagyon sok
Sustainable
időt, úgy tudom,
Development
nem
Council,
kapott,
although I've heard
de
he
talán így is.
he wasn't given too much time to speak,
Jól
but let's
kiegészíti
hope
majd mindazt, amit
he
én most
will be
elmondtam
able to
önöknek.
complement all the things
A
that
javasolt
I've said
módszer
with things that I haven't said.
alkalmas arra,
So the proposed
megmutassa, hogy a
method
GDP
can be used
mennyire
to show the
fenntartható,
extent
vagy
to which the
fenntarthatatlan
GDP
módon
is
termeltük
produced
meg,
in a
és
sustainable
további
or
információkat nyújt a
unsustainable way,
szükséges
and also
beavatkozásokhoz.
provides additional information for
Lehetővé téve
necessary
ezáltal
interventions,
a hatékonyabb
thus enabling
szakpolitikai
more
döntéshozatalt.
effective policymaking.
Az országok sajátosságai közötti
It also
különbségek
allows
elismerése mellett is
standardization of the
lehetővé
measurement of
teszi
sustainability
a fenntarthatósági
turnaround
fordulat mérésének
while
standardizálását.
recognizing differences
Az
between
egyes
country
országokon
specifics.
belüli időbeli
By
összehasonlítás révén
comparing
pedig
within countries over
segíti a
time,
fejlődési
it
fázisoknak
helps to
megfelelő
build a picture
képalkotást.
that reflects the stages of development. In summary,
Alkalmas a
it
teljesebb
provides
kép
a more
megalkotására,
comprehensive picture.
a
It
gazdasági,
allows
társadalmi
for a
környezeti
better
folyamatok
understanding
jobb
of social,
megértésére,
economic, environmental
könnyebb
processes.
döntési helyzet
It facilitates
előidézésére
decision making
és a
and
kockázatok
it reduces
csökkentésére.
risks.
Ez a módszer
This
jól
method
mutatja, hogy nem csak a
illustrates
gazdasági
that it
kérdésekről
is not
kell
only
beszélni.
economic growth that we need
Ez a
to talk
módszer
about.
megmutatja
This method shows the so-called externalities, the negative effects of our economic
Ez a
activity.
módszer
This
segít
method helps to
eltüntetni
remove
a GDP
the blind spots
foltjait.
of the GDP.
Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim!
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen,
Az elmúlt héten egy vízügyes
last week I
konferencián
spoke at a
idéztem
water conference and I
Benjamin
quoted
Franklin, aki azt
Benjamin
mondta,
Franklin,
18.
who said in the
században,
18th century,
az Egyesült Államok egyik alapító atyájáról
one
van
of the
szó,
founding fathers of the United States of
Amikor a kút
America,
kiszárad,
when the well runs dry, he said,
akkor ismerjük meg a
then we
víz
know the true
valódi
value
értékét.
of water.
Benjamin Franklin gondolatát
Well,
folytatva,
continuing along the lines of Benjamin Franklin,
mire alkalmasak ezek az
what are these
indikátorok?
indicators suitable for?
Alkalmasak arra, hogy
They are
megtudjuk,
useful for us
mennyi
to
víz van
know
még a kútban.
how much water is left in the
Hogy
well,
megtudjuk,
to
az a
find
mód,
out if
ahogy
the way
használjuk a
we are
vizet,
using water now
a kút
is
kiszáradásához
causing
vezet.
the well to run dry.
Ez pedig a földművelést,
This in
a
turn
helyben
makes
maradást,
farming,
röviden
staying home,
az életet
in short,
lehetetleníti el.
it makes life
Mi
impossible.
azon fáradoztunk, hogy
We
olyan
have
a
worked,
módszert adjunk a
endeavored to
döntéshozók
give decision
kezébe,
makers around the world
ami a
a
világ
way
minden pontján
to
segít
prevent
elkerülni
wells from
hogy a
running
kút
dry
kiszáradjon.
anywhere in the world.
Eredményes
I
tanácskozást.
wish you all a
kívánok
very
mindegyiknek.
successful meeting.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for starting us off. And I have to say, you've also started off the second session, which is going to be all about this topic. And I feel that you've really put us in a very interesting place. It's certainly one of the recommendations for the Pact for the Future. And there's a lot of activity going on in this space. And it's very, very interesting, I think, for those of us delegates from outside Hungary to learn and to understand some of the developments that have been happening here. I would now like to invite the members of our very distinguished panel to join us, please, and we will get the second part of this third plenary session underway. Thank you very much. Each of our colleagues will speak for a relatively short length of time. I say that advisedly. Some of them will have some slides, others don't. And then at the end of that, we'll then have a little bit more of a discussion in which I will be chairing. To very start with, please can I invite the Honourable Emmanuel Blade Nzimande, from the Department of Science, Innovation and the Minister of Science and Innovation in South Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me greet Honorable former President, and thanks for your keynote address, and Program Director, and fellow panelists. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Firstly, let me start by acknowledging that the World Science Forum has indeed become a very important platform for scientists and policymakers to not only come together and share experiences, but to also assess the impact of existing interventions. That are implemented through various multilateral bodies with the view to secure the future of humanity by building a more equal and just world through science. I want to say that as South Africa, we indeed do welcome the Pact of the Future and its adoption by the United Nations General Assembly as a very timely intervention which also seeks to push forward the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Because, truth be told, a failure to achieve at least the core of the Sustainable Development Goals will have huge negative impact. Increased inequality in the world and indicators of poverty, unemployment as well, will go down. I'm not going to go to what the document, this Pact for the Future, says. What I just want to point out is that in South Africa we have got our own decadal plan, which is a 10-year plan from 2022 to 2032 on harnessing and mobilizing and advancing science, technology, and innovation to address the needs that face South Africa, but also that face our continent. Our decadal plan basically has got 4 main pillars. Firstly is the issue of dealing with climate change and environmental sustainability. Secondly, the future of education, skills, and work, a very important matter. Thirdly, the future of society itself. And fourthly, modernizing our economy, especially our key pillars of the South African economy, mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. So the South African societal grand challenge on climate change, as contained in our decadal plan, and environmental sustainability, we believe will address and will use that as a key platform to address most of the 12 actions of the Pact as adopted by UNGA. Now, what I just want to suggest is just to highlight perhaps 6 key areas, and I'm not going to talk to each of them, that we think are important if we are to take forward the Pact for the Future within the context of science, technology, and intervention. The first challenge is international peace and security. And I think it's very important for us to really examine and look closely at the issue of science and peace and the role of science in bringing about peace. And no one can deny that in the light of the current geopolitical tensions, which pose serious threats going forward, not least to science, we need to ask the question, what role should science be playing in bringing about peace and stability in the world, including, by the way, the very important issue of this live genocide that we are seeing taking place in Gaza, and the world failing to do anything about it, hardly. So that is the foundation upon which we can say we want to take forward whatever else we want to do. The second issue, of course, linked to that is pandemic preparedness. There's one big lesson from COVID-19, that we all need to be better prepared for pandemics that are coming, as our own science is telling us, including the issue of vaccine development and equitable distribution. Those things are very important, especially for the African continent. Also, the issue of building climate-resilient infrastructure. Science really has a huge role to play, given the inclement weather that we are experiencing globally. The fourth issue is African research and science's funding. As a continent, for understandable reason, for instance, we are very much dependent on donors, but we need our international friends to help us to determine our own African agenda and be able to support it, rather than having an African agenda that is just almost exclusively donor-driven. That is very important if we are to realize this. Now, the last point that is important in achieving this is that of harnessing science for gender equality and the fight against gender-based violence, which actually is threatening to be a new pandemic in many parts of the world. If we don't do this, we are going to marginalize the participation of women in science and consequently women in society generally. And we want to say that as an African continent, for instance, which science also needs to take into account, we are a young continent, which means we are a continent of the future. African youth properly empowered through science, amongst other things, has a huge role to play in providing the much needed skills and scientific advances that the whole world needs. African youth is a global asset rather than just a continental asset. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think you've given us a lot already to think about for the discussion that is to come, and hopefully also throughout the day. It gives me great pleasure now to invite our next speaker, and that is Jerry Sheehan, who's the Director of Science at the OECD.
Well, good morning. It is a great pleasure for me to be here with you at the World Science Forum, and in particular at this session on taking forward the results of the Summit of the Future. I think it's without a doubt that the Summit for the Future gave renewed momentum to our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Agenda as we approach the last half of the decade before the 2030 ambitions. And I think there's no doubt, certainly among anyone in this room, that science, technology, innovation, and digital technologies are key to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And there's no doubt that OECD can help contribute to advancing this great agenda. The issues around science, technology, innovation, and digital technologies are the heart of my portfolio at the OECD, and we're aligning ourselves with other elements of the OECD and even more globally beyond the OECD membership to help us tackle these issues. We're working beyond our 38 current member countries. We have 8 new countries on the accession path into the OECD, including 3 in this geographic region: Croatia, Romania, and Bulgaria, as well as new members joining us in Southeast Asia and in South America that will help give us a more diverse and inclusive approach to the work that we do. And beyond these, especially in areas of science and technology and innovation, we have great collaboration with a broad number of other countries that play a critical role in science, technology, and innovation and in helping us achieve the SDGs. These include, of course, South Africa, that is a full associate member of our Global Science Forum, as well as India, that is co-chairing the current Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which is at the OECD. So I think we have an opportunity now to share with you some of the work that we're doing at the OECD that can help contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the sustainable agenda based on science, technology, and innovation. And of course, a key part of that is trying to boost investments in science and technology, investments in research and development around the globe. It's essential not only to help us develop new knowledge, new technologies, but also to help countries and communities develop the skills and the so-called absorptive capacity they'll need to adopt and adapt technologies from around the world. It's clear that we need renewed efforts to boost R&D investments, in particular in the developing economies. Global R&D expenditures as a share of GDP, as you can see on the chart, have risen 25% since 2000, reaching 1.9% of GDP in 2021, and in fact, more than 2.5% on average in the OECD countries. But this trend has not been replicated, in particular in the least developed countries, where R&D expenditures have flatlined at just 0.25% of GDP. One option is to help mobilize better official development assistance toward STI issues. The level remains frustratingly low, stabilizing at only about 1.2 to 1.4% of ODA from 2019 to 2021. And there are opportunities in particular for official development assistance to better target STI projects in less developed countries. But we need to do more. We also need to look at innovative approaches to blended finance, such as the idea of STI for debt swaps. These operate somewhat like the climate debt swaps, with creditors agreeing to forgive or reduce debt interest on loans if a country invests in R&D. We at OECD have provided principles to help mobilize and promote the use of blended finance, and we've provided guidance for implementing them. And in fact, this guidance is being updated now, and you'll see some new results in 2025. But beyond just increasing our investments in R&D, we need to find better ways to align and direct the STI agenda to better address the challenges that we face globally in achieving the SDGs. This was an overarching theme of the ministerial level meeting we held back in April of this year with 68 different delegations, which focused on the notion of transformative STI policies to foster sustainability and inclusivity. One of the major deliverables of this ministerial work was a new transformative agenda for STI policies. It provides policy guidance and implementation ideas to address societal challenges through approaches that are much more inclusive, anticipatory, adaptive, more experimental, and of course, evidence-based. And this will all require greater cross-governmental and international coordination to achieve. This transformative agenda identifies policy orientations that include greater directionality in our R&D funding, targeting R&D to those areas that need more investment to help us achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. It also focuses on the importance of values, ensuring equity and inclusion in our STI agendas, as well as greater coordination across governments, so our STI policies are aligned with those of industry ministries, of those that are finance ministries, and those coming out of our regulatory agencies. And of course, we need more experimentation and agility. We have to apply these across multiple areas of STI policy, not just R&D funding, but what are we going to do about the workforce development, international partnerships and others that can be geared toward more open science and co-creation. We're now beginning to pilot this transformative agenda through a series of country studies. We're also have ambitions of devising new policy guidance and toolkits that will help all countries to take this new approach in reorienting their STI policies. We're also advancing new work on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility for STI. One of our key projects, for example, is looking at how different forms of disadvantage interact to stifle careers in science technology fields. These can include differences in gender, ethnicity, social class, and disabilities, for example. We've created a new dedicated dashboard on our STI policy compass focusing on policies for EDIA to help us share good practice and identify policies that can be shared and compared across countries. We're also preparing new resources that'll help us better understand and track research careers, the composition of the workforce, issues around mobility between different sectors of the economy, as well as globally. This new resource called the Research and Innovation Careers Observatory was launched with assistance from the European Commission just last September. And we aim to have first data available in the spring of 2025 that'll help us also understand issues around lifelong learning, working conditions, and others to help us ensure that research careers and research career policies are responsive to the realities that researchers face. I note the emphasis on gender and gender equality. We're looking at ways in particular to help empower women in science, technology, and innovation and digital careers. In the latest Digital Economy Outlook that we launched just 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago it was now this week, we highlighted some of the vast differences in the number of men and women working in the so-called ICT sector. The share of men working as ICT specialists, information computing and telecommunications specialists, is 3 to 7 times higher than the share of women across OECD countries. And these low rates of ICT specialization also contribute to a gender wage gap, as these jobs, such as those related to AI, enjoy sustainable wage premiums. I'll finish with just a word on global engagement on artificial intelligence. We noticed that the Pact for the Future, for example, puts a strong emphasis on digital cooperation, and this is an area in which OECD has been involved for many, many years. Fundamental to the work that we have been doing has been the OECD recommendation on AI, which was first adopted back in 2019 and was revised just about 6 months ago to help reflect some of the latest changes in artificial intelligence and associated policymaking. It promotes a values-based, human-centric approach to both drive innovation, but ensure that we have the right protections in place for a values-based approach to AI development and its proper governance. We have been developing as well tools, definitions, and common frameworks to help promote greater interoperability across AI governance regulations and approaches around the world and in different countries. In July of this past year, we combined our own work at the OECD on artificial intelligence with the work of the so-called Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, which now gives us a combined force of 44 countries working on equal footing to help advance the AI agenda. Again, looking for opportunities to use AI to help address issues in the sustainable development goals, while at the same time ensuring a human-centric, rights-based approach, and their ambitions for engaging a greater number of countries that share an interest in this important agenda. We also announced we'll have greater collaboration with the UN on issues around AI governance, in particular, promoting rigorous scientific and evidence-based assessments of opportunities and risks associated with AI. And I hope these, again, will help us all to achieve more of the sustainable development agenda. I believe there are many opportunities for us all to work together on this broad agenda, to use STI for good, and to use our artificial intelligence to help us in achieving the goals. And I look forward to discussing this further with you during the panel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jerry. I think the slide that you had with the relative, with the curve, the graph of R&D spend, I think for me, and I think maybe for a lot of us, was really actually quite telling, and I think that'll give us some, again, some food for thought in our discussion. I'd now like to invite Professor Andras Solushinaji, who's the UNESCO Chair in Water Conflict Management at the University of Public Service. Professor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this is not going to be a terribly optimistic intervention. The message is simply as follows: no water, no sustainability, no SDG. However, before we go any further, let us remind ourselves the huge tragedy that has taken place 3 weeks ago in Valencia and in Malaga, a never experienced flash flood that has never occurred in history. 300 people died. Many are still missing. 300 billion euros damage. In 8 hours, the annual precipitation over the catchment area has fallen down, causing havoc, disaster, including health issues. Let me follow up on President Ader's presentation when he displayed the matrix of the 17 SDGs, and let me give this matrix a somewhat subjective interpretation, namely, water and sanitation are the centerpiece of the SDGs. No water, no SDGs. Try and go through that matrix without water. It's going to collapse. What are the drivers? The drivers are numerous. The two most important drivers which we have to talk about is the population growth that has been double exponential ever since the Industrial Revolution. And last but least, climate change, which was a principal cause of the cold drop over Valencia. If one looks at the SDG implementation, this is a somewhat old figure, just prior to the end of the Millennium Development Goal period. It is shown where the problems are and where the problems do not exist. They do not exist in North America, in Europe, in Australia, in New Zealand, but in Africa, we still have huge problems. And the problems are exacerbated by the climate change that occurred, even though during the Holocene, we had the luck of having a relatively stable climate. And the impacts are similar. If you look at the impacts of these global changes, you see that ever since the Industrial Revolution, the carbon dioxide release to the atmosphere exponential. You see that ever since we have regular meteorological observations, the climate has increased by 1.4 degrees. You see that the anthropogenic nitrogen fixation is exponential. You see that the nitrogen fluxes to the coastal zones is exponential. You see that the loss of tropical forest is exponential. You see that the species extension according to the known taxonomy is also exponential. Everything is exponential, including the number of McDonald's restaurants. This should send us a warning signal with respect to an age-old hypothesis upon which we design our systems. We entered a new geological epoch, the Anthropocene. Everything has been changed. You can find hardly any place in the Earth where the hydrological cycle did not go through major changes. This is a figure which I have borrowed from an earlier issue of Nature, where the problem of tipping points were discussed by Rockström and company. And they came to the conclusion that although in biodiversity loss, we are beyond the tipping point, the point of no return in climate change. The same thing. In freshwater, we are safe because 4,000 cubic kilometers freshwater intake is the limit. And in those days, 10 years ago, there was only 2,000 something. In 6 years' time, probably we will lead the 4,000 limit. And then things start to switch out. And what we observe is there are major floods and droughts occurring at the same time all over the place, as if the frequency of the hydrological cycle has gone up all over the place, whether you talk about France, a flash flood in Department Aude, never observed, whether you look at an incredible flood a few years back in the Ahr River in Germany, or you look at Belgium, a flash flood in Brussels, or you look at Catania in Italy, or you look at the flood disaster in Pakistan with 4 billion US losses, or you look at the flash floods in India, or you look at Cyclone Boris in September here, which was unusual and produced the second largest flow in the Danube in Budapest within 10 years. And this is supposed to occur once in every 300 years. And yet there are some people, probably from the Flat Earth Department, who have a somewhat different view. Things have changed dramatically over the past 100 years, and it's gonna be even worse in the coming 100 years. And this is the critical point we have to deal with. Stationarity is dead. The future is not gonna be the same as the past. And we have all over the world, from the US to Hungary, the standards, the engineering design standards are based upon the hypothesis of stationarity. Same mean value, same variance, same correlation structure, same spectral properties. And this is not true. The good news, however, as the previous speakers referred to, that there is hope. Technology and science have contributed immensely over the possible solution of these problems in the coming years. Big data algorithms, artificial intelligence, machine learning, sequential learning, they all provide an incredible hope. What we have to do probably in order to avoid that we will have more floods and extremes is to go and increase the resilience of our systems, because there's not much hope, particularly here in Eastern Europe. If, according to the pessimistic scenario, and there are 32 atmospheric global circulation models which simulate what's going to happen, and in the past 20 years in Central Europe, here where we are, the temperature increase will likely be 6 degrees centigrade. And that is huge. It will increase the speed, the velocity of the hydrological cycle, and the probability of the extremes at both ends will increase. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change is all about water. 80% of the climate change impacts are manifested through, with, and by water. So water, therefore, is a means that provides adaptation to deal with the issue. We need to increase our resilience. That's the only way ahead. And we can either go where the water is, or we bring water where we are, or take the linear combination of the two. As I mentioned, the huge progress occurred, and that gives rise to optimism, particularly in areas that data secrecy due to remote sensing technologies will be gone, and it offers new opportunities. The 20+ satellites that are up there and are sending huge amount of data that are hydrologically relevant to the Earth every single day. Remote sensing is a hope whereby we can also estimate how groundwater bodies are changing. We have systems that are integrating from data capturing all the way out down to disseminating forecasts. Japan provides an excellent example in that. Big data algorithms. Every single day, there's 1 exabyte data that is hydrologically relevant that comes to the Earth. 1 exabyte is 1, followed by 18 0. It's a huge baby. But now the algorithms what we have provide a large speed processing. When I was a student at the beginning of the Holocene, then we had these analog models because the flow patterns were so complicated, three-dimensional elliptic partial differential equations with random boundary conditions that were not able to handle that. Huge progress occurred. However, my students are calculating the interaction between the sediment and water and 3-dimensional velocity fields, which was unimaginable 30 years back. So there is hope that science is there to help, and that's the only hope that is there. Well, We need to retool our approaches. Educate politicians. That's a huge task. But we have to educate ourselves also in order to be able to talk to politicians, not in the tohu vabohu what we are using with stochastic differential equations, which is my love, but in a way that they understand in making policies. Ultimately, sustainable development that relies on these three pillars is underpinned with one very important consideration that so far we haven't considered properly, and that's culture. Culture is the one that underpins our future and our survivability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. So often it's the natural scientists who are the ones who often sort of, they're the ones that we expect to say things are good and, and there is hope. And then it's the social scientists and the humanities scholars who sort of turn around and then all give us a bit of a reality check and say, but. And so with that in mind, I wonder whether our next speaker is going to do just that. Gustavo Marino, who's the Director for Social Policies at the UN Science and Cultural Agency, UNESCO.
Thank you. Good morning, all. It's a pleasure to be here in this magnificent hall. And well, after this sobering presentation by my colleague Andras, I hope I can not necessarily give you too much optimism. I think he left us a lot to think about, but to come back to, in this discussion of the Pact of the Future, I would like to tell you what we are doing at UNESCO and how we can go ahead with this important initiative of the Pact of the Future. So, I mean, the challenge we face today, indeed, and our colleagues have talked about it, climate change, inequality, technological disruptions, are interconnected and systemic. Solving them requires fresh tools and new ways of thinking. While we celebrate achievements like lifting over 1 billion people out of poverty over the last 3 decades, the fact is that only 17% of the SDGs are on track and reminds of the urgent action needed. This was also addressed earlier in the conversation. And the pact, but here the issue of the Summit of the Future provided opportunities to contribute to these challenges. So let me talk to you about some areas of work we're doing in UNESCO. It's not all of them, but some that are related to the Summit of the Future and the Pact of the Future. First, and given the topic of this edition of the World Science Forum, talk about responsible science and research. This is especially relevant, and for UNESCO it's very important. It's part of what we see Action 30 in the Pact for the Future, which emphasizes the need to ensure that scientific research is conducted responsibly, ethically, and with respect for human rights. Now, the UNESCO 2017 recommendation on science and scientific researchers, which was adopted by 195 member states, is key to implementing this Action 30 of the Pact of the Future. It calls for protecting the freedom of scientists and autonomy of researchers, while ensuring that science serves societal well-being. UNESCO is further supporting through this what we have the new program on the freedom and safety of scientists, which addresses rising threats to researchers, especially women and underrepresented groups, and fosters public trust in science. Together with this, in this normative instrument, ensures that science remains powerful, ethical tool for addressing today's challenges and shaping sustainable futures. Now, I would like to mention now here very briefly, also very high importance is the protection of scientists in conflict and emerging situations, with more conflicts than ever since the science ecosystem is not properly giving the same attention as other sectors in terms of the protection that is needed, despite its importance. And we've just heard our colleagues saying how science is so important to think about the future. Another issue that was also touched by a colleague from the OECD is artificial intelligence, and this is a key element in the Global Digital Compact. As part of the Summit of the Future's outcomes, I'd like to mention the importance of this Global Digital Compact to address the governance of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence. But it's not only that, it's also neurotech that's also very important and looming. AI's potential to transform societies is immense, but it must be developed and used responsibly. AI development is now dominated by just a handful of countries and a handful of companies, and is indeed has significant potential, but also many challenges and ethical concerns. The Global Digital Compact aims to change this narrative by promoting inclusive policies that align AI with human rights and the rule of law. UNESCO has been at the forefront of the ethical AI governance through the recommendation of the ethics of AI, which was adopted globally by all the member states of UNESCO, 194 countries now. And one instrument that's very important that comes from the recommendation is what we call the Readiness Assessment Methodology, or RAM, which helps countries build the regulatory and institutional capacities needed for ethical AI implementation. We now have over around 60 countries working on the RAMs with UNESCO support, and these efforts align with the Pact for the Future's broader commitment to ensure that technological advancements benefit everyone equally, fostering trust and reducing global disparities. By the way, we had a few weeks ago Daron Acemoglu, one of this year's Nobel laureates, talking about his book on power and progress, examining technological progress over millennia. And one of his important conclusions is that the technological progress does not automatically lift all boats and include shared prosperity. That is a choice, and it's a choice we have to make as countries. It depends on the policy we do, and that's why it's so relevant to look also at the ethical aspects. Now, another key element of the Pact of the Future is its commitment to intergenerational justice. This is embedded in the Declaration of for Future Generations, which calls for long-term thinking to safeguard the interests of future generations. UNESCO contributes through its Futures Literacy and Foresight program, part of the Management of Social Transformations program, which equips policymakers and communities with tools to anticipate and shape the future proactively. Futures literacy is not just about imagining the future, it's about using those insights to design policies that are inclusive, equitable, and sustainable, and using foresight technologies to make sure we get there. And last, I would like to mention, there are many topics. Gender has been an issue raised by my predecessor. I won't dwell on that now, but obviously it's one of the key priorities of UNESCO. But I will talk last about youth empowerment, which is also central to the Pact of the Future. Youth is a priority group for UNESCO, with over half of the world's population under the age of 30. Half is under the age of 30. And as Minister Simande mentioned, in the case of Africa, it's 70% of the population being young people. The demographic significance of this group cannot be overstated. Yet they face immense challenges, including barriers to education, employment, and decision-making processes. The message, which is very strong during the summit in New York, is that youth are ethical to implementing the actions that are laid out in the Pact for the Future. To succeed, we must also engage with young people, providing them with the tools, platforms, and opportunities to take and to participate in shaping these important initiatives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Gustavo. And really, last but not least, it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Sir Peter Luckman from New Zealand. He's travelled all the way from New Zealand, former Chief Scientific Advisor and President of the International Council for Science.
For those of you who look at the programme, you'll realise I'm not my dear friend Princess Samaya, who couldn't get here today. But what I'd like to do is just reflect on the Pact of the Future. You can look at it in two ways, either cynically or hopefully. Cynically is it's very broad, 56 action points, called action points, but when you look at them, there's not much action in them. They're all aspirational statements rather than measurable goals or anything that can be achieved. And I think it's disappointing, but understandable in the current geostrategic tension, that there wasn't more focus on addressing the gaps that sit there, which we know are there, because the lack of progress on the SDGs has been so manifestly obvious. On the other hand, you can look at it hopefully. Here were governments actually agreeing to a set of aspirational goals or reinforcing a set of aspirational goals. And within that, There's a significant change from what was done in the Millennium or the SDG goals, and that it's a broader scope document. And one of the things that really matters to me, and I think to all of us here, is it increases and emphasises the role of science and technology and innovation in meeting those 56 aspirational statements within the Pact of the Futures. But again, we need to be honest. It's easy to say that we will use science and technology, but we have to start to see science and technology better embedded into the policy making at every level of government, from multilateral to national to local government. And frankly, if you look around the world, with some exceptions, including the Secretary-General's office itself, there's been a decline rather than increase in the use of science advice within government systems. Why is that the case? Well, part of it is this decline in trust in science, which has happened as there's been a decline in trust in institutions because of political and situations and because of the changed information environment. So I think of all the things that we need to do, we need to emphasise yet again, let's not leave science and technology on the edge of policy making, but let's bring it more centrally into the actual discussions that need to happen where the key decisions are made. Now, I'm president of the International Science Council. It's the principal NGO that represents both the natural and social sciences and the science-associated humanities in the global arena. It's based in Paris. It's comprised of national academies, funders, international scientific organisations, young academies, and so forth. It operates in different ways. It has a number of affiliated bodies, most notably the International Network for Government Science Advice. It has regional chapters. It's a complex organisation. And what we've been doing is rebuilding it, and it aligns very much with the intent of the Pact of the Futures. The principal mission of the ISC is to be the global voice for and of science. And you don't have a voice if you don't have anybody listening to it. So what we've been doing is refocusing our efforts to make sure that we have a strong, clear voice to those who need to hear from the active scientific community what needs to happen. We've rebuilt our strategic plan and focused it, and it aligns very well with what some of the other speakers have said and what I think is the intent within the Pact. First of all, we focused very much, and helped with Saba Karosi and others, we've built our voice in New York. And so now we have a particular relationship with the Secretary-General's office and making sure that they get access to expert advice from the global north, south, east and west, properly pluralistic in every way on particular issues that the Secretary-General's office needs to know about. We've worked with UNESCO to build what we call a group of friends on science for action to help member states in New York understand how science can help in their negotiations. We've built an office in New York. We're working well with the Geneva part of the UN system. This is a big shift. Our second strategic plan is around science diplomacy. Now, clearly, we're not a formal diplomatic organisation, but we can provide unique capacities and track to science diplomacy. And we're strictly apolitical. Every country in the world is a member of the ISC, directly or indirectly. And we're very careful to stay out of the geostrategic tensions and try and use science to ensure relationships can be sustained. Increasingly, we're being asked to take on quite a lot of roles in ensuring scientific cooperation across geopolitical boundaries. The third area, which links to what Gustavo's just said, we focus and always have on freedom and responsibility in science, and we work closely with UNESCO in that area. But I particularly emphasise some of the other things we've done. For instance, in the AI space, we recognised there was a gap between statements we need to regulate, we need to govern, and asking the question, why do you need to regulate? What do you need to regulate? How would you make decisions? And so after a year of consultation, we've developed a framework under which an organisation or a government can make its assessment of what it needs to regulate and why. And a number of countries are now picking that up, and we've worked well with the UN system and others to ensure that the practical aspects of AI regulation can be considered. We see a number of gaps in the ethical consideration of science. One of them was raised by Minister Blade in his comments, namely the ethical responsibilities of scientific funders. The issues of when global north funders tell global south scientists what to do is no longer acceptable. We need new ways and ethical guidelines, not just for scientists, but for funding organisations as well. We need, and we work hard, and we work closely with the European Union on this, on the issues of how do we promote trust in science. Fourthly, scientific cooperation has been mentioned by a number of the speakers here, and we've worked in a number of ways. For instance, our work with the United Nations Environment Programme on anticipatory foresight, our work with the United Nations Development Programme on expanding the concept of human development, our work with UNDRR on a taxonomy of disaster risk management. And one of the areas we want to work on is the existential crisis that has emerged, and WHO has asked us to pick it up. Namely, this explosion of concerns about mental health in young people, the doubling to tripling of rates of mental health in young people, which no society can work if 30 or 40% of its young people are not fully mentally well. And so there are issues here which bring social science, natural science, together across cultures and boundaries, where I think the ISC can play a unique role. There's much else we do through our affiliate bodies. For instance, we have the World Climate Research Programme, jointly with the World Meteorological Organization. We have the Standing Committee on Antarctic Research, which is a part of our organisation, which is, of course, leading with us the International Polar Year of 2032. And jointly with UNESCO, we're working heavily with them on how the decade for science, for sustainability, is not just a tokenistic decade, but actually does make a difference. And finally, almost finally, the fifth theme of our work is around the changing nature of science itself. Science and science systems are undergoing rapid change. AI is going to change both the production and reporting of knowledge in big ways. The future of scientific publishing has been a long, complex issue, and we continue to work on that. But most of all, I think we have taken the global lead in promoting the need for transdisciplinarity. How do the sciences work not just with each other, but with communities, policymakers, which leads to a very different way of conducting, funding and evaluating science. And the ISC has taken a major part in both analysing how that can be done and putting its money where its mouth is and actually starting to fund projects in that area. There's much more I could talk about, but as some of you know, I'm a New Zealander and we'd like to talk rather bluntly. So at the end of my address to the high-level political forum of the UN in 2023, I quoted from the last line of Bertolt Brecht's play on Galileo. Now, I'm not sure he wrote this line. I think it may have been later producers that added the line to the play. But the last line reads, "Use science wisely or everyone will die." That did shock the high-level political forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. Boy, this has been it's been a bit of council of despair, isn't it, this panel? Hope and more despair, but let's hope. We have, I think the clock is showing about maybe 25 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that. So I'm just going to ask all of you just really one question, and then I'd really like to invite our distinguished audience to also to tell us what they think, to make a comment or to ask a question. I guess, we're here talking with the summit theme is the Pact for the Future, and I just want to zoom out a little bit, of course. I mean, the Pact for the Future, in a way, is a sort of success in that it achieved an outcome, and, Peter, you kind of made that point that, of course, these things can always be better, but it was at least an outcome. Right now we're in the last day, possibly last 48 hours of the COP29 climate summit, where we may not get an outcome in Baku. And it's been a busy year in this space. The COP16 biodiversity summit in Cali was not a particular success, and there's going to be just in the coming days, we'll see the end or the last of the process for the plastics treaty. That's not going well, particularly. And then, of course, you've also got Minister Nzimande, you mentioned the pandemic. There's the talks on the pandemic treaty. Again, really sort of quite stuck, and essentially stuck around, some of the common themes, where industry has a much bigger role than in earlier years, a lot more north-south tensions and arguments over funding, which then I guess just leads me to the point that, which some scientists are starting to say, and there was a letter published by a very eminent group of researchers a while ago. It's got some traction now, really asking the international community that what is the point of all of these activities when the follow-up isn't happening? Why are we doing this very performance-based, this very performative activity? And it's genuinely good to see. It's multilateral cooperation. I think we all want to see that. But I think from a lot of researchers' perspective, there is real, I don't remember, my first COP was COP3 in 1997, and I just do not remember a time where there's been so much despondency in the scientific community. So just really ask you to reflect on that, and perhaps Minister Nzimande, you could start.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Program Director. If I understand you well, you're saying, also picking up on some of the conclusions, that there's more pessimism about the prospects of, am I right?
A lot of talk.
Yes.
But no
but
action.
Little action.
If I could just summarize it in a few words.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's the point I was trying to raise in my own brief input. That maybe what I was talking about, what I was raising, on reflection now, also listening to others, were more contextual issues to the implementation or the realization of the Pact for the Future. And what are some of the things that perhaps we are not paying adequate attention to that needs to be elevated? Pact for the Future itself raises an important issue, which I lifted up, that of funding. Because that's one really big issue. Sometimes some of us refer to South Africa's constitution, which is regarded as amongst the best in the world, saying, yes, it is, but in some respects it's an unfunded mandate. That perhaps the issue that we are facing, amongst others, is that we get all these commitments, beautiful and so on, but they constitute an unfunded mandate because there isn't actual commitment to giving the kinds of funds that we need. That's the one thing. The second and last thing I would just like to say quickly is perhaps the more important role of science that has been raised in addressing these particular issues. And I do agree with Peter that it's not a question of, the role of science like as an add-on, that science needs to be placed at the center of whatever we are doing. Our department in South Africa, we are now saying our preoccupation is putting science, technology, and innovation at the center of government, industry, and society. That is what also we need to do in placing science at the center. It's a pity, though, that we are still fighting against skeptics, people who do not believe in science. There's no global warming, and so on. That's the battle we face. That's where science then becomes important in order to counter those voices. That will perhaps contribute towards realizing the goals that we have set for ourselves. Thank you.
Jerry, maybe I can bring you in. I mean, it's a slightly unfair question that I'm going to ask you, because I know you're on the sort of more research side of OECD and you're not on the sort of diplomatic side, and I think just to really make that distinction clear. But some of these arguments that we're seeing, are that other members of the G20, particularly global South countries, are saying that, there's a lot of historical inequality that, has not been recognized. And I think the graph that you put up there about R&D spending flatlining, one way of reading that is it's an indication of inequality. That one group is sort of going up and the other group is flatlining. But then on the other side, of course, you also have OECD members saying that now the share of the G20 in the world economy is greater, and so G20 countries, principally formerly of the global South, should do more. Where do you see some of these discussions?
Okay, no, thank you. I think it's an important question, and I think you can see it. Maybe this is where talk is turning into action. And maybe I'm the optimist on the panel or something today, my glass being half full. I think it's clear, right? I mean, that in the current geopolitical environment, it's really hard to get all countries aligned and achieve on some of the kinds of treaties and other advances that you were listing in the beginning of your comments. I see it, though, as we've got an expanding set of countries who are eager to work on these issues with us, right? So, we within the OECD are the OECD 38 member countries plus the EU. But increasingly, right, a growing coalition of countries that want to work on these issues with us in taking a somewhat like-minded approach to addressing the challenges of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this occurs across the OECD. I'll just say from my own experience, my own portfolio there, when we organized our ministerial meeting on science and technology 6 months ago, we had 68 delegations show up. In fact, I think we had everybody here on the panel. We had UNESCO, we had the UN, we had the ISC, we had South Africa, we had the accession countries to the OECD, and many others around the country who wanted to work on the particular issues we were putting on the agenda. I mentioned the one about using and thinking about how to retool, if you will, our toolbox for S&T policy to achieve major transitions. And we had more countries wanting to join us at the table to help work that out. The other big deliverable I didn't mention from that ministerial meeting was a framework for the governance of emerging technologies. How do we advance responsible innovation, building on what we know from our AI principles, building on what we know from our neurotechnology principles, which we're also updating now, but how do we take those lessons and carry those forward into quantum, synthetic biology, other technologies we're going to need to get us to the goal. And again, we had great enthusiasm and adherence to those. It's not the whole global environment, but it's an increasingly wide set of countries. Repeated just a couple of weeks ago, we brought consumer policy ministers together for a ministerial meeting. Again, 64, 65, 67, I just recall, delegations that came for that, because we were looking at one of the other key elements in this. What was the role of consumers, of all of us as individuals who purchase goods and services, in helping achieve the green and the digital transitions, and what are the risks that we face, and great enthusiasm around those. So yes, we're not at the point that we can get global consensus, and perhaps not in a increasingly globally fractured environment, but we can do more, I think, than the coalitions of the willing. I think we can build out from a core of countries that want to address these issues, where the words do become meaningful, right, and give us some goals and ambitions. Can we get those countries aligned to move on them in ways that are going to be rights-based, human-centric? And I do have optimism about that.
Thank you. Professor Andras, in one of your slides, or I think in one of your remarks, everything was going up exponentially, but in the wrong direction. And that's, principally, the work of scientists like yourself. And the frustration is that, that knowledge isn't being listened to. Do you share that frustration?
Oh, absolutely and totally. And I think the big issue, what we need, perhaps this conference needs to discuss it and get it out as a strong message, is that there's still a huge gap between policies and science. Most of the time, policies are made on the principles of outdated science. Again, probably the reason behind is the lack of proper communication with the political community. But of course, that's a two-way street. And the politicians are designed for 4 years, if they're lucky. And their basic drive is to get re-elected for another 4 years. Now, I fully agree with His Excellency, the Minister, who said that we have to somehow make science and technology the centerpiece of government policies. Otherwise, we're going to go down the drain, all of us. In 100 years, this is not doomsday. This is UN population division, pretty reliable population forecast. Exactly 20 years, exactly 100 years from now, we will be, those guys who come after, there will be 12 billion human beings. And that's the tipping point. What will happen after that, we don't know. But probably one thing is sure, that the human civilization as we knew it for the past 6,000 years is going to change dramatically. And this is not a centerpiece of political thinking. And most of the politicians are still believe that, those eggheads are coming up with all sorts of funny things, doomsday. This is real, ladies and gentlemen. Same thing in climate change, that the two ways of coping with the impacts of climate change, one is mitigation, and the other one is adaptation. Mitigation is a long-term thing. That's what the Paris Agreement was all about. Most of the COP discussion is about mitigation. But, it took humanity 200 years, basically, to screw up the climate. So mitigation will not fix it in 1 year or 2 years. So adaptation is an important piece. How do we adapt to the situation? How do we adapt, for instance, Africa in the Sahel? Sahel is getting drier than ever before. And as a net result of it, there's a mass migration from the rural to the urban areas. Look at what happens in Nairobi. 2 million people living in shantytown. So there's a whole chain of events. And if we would like to cope with that, we have to adapt. And that's what I was trying to say, that one of the very important adaptation mechanisms is through, with, and by water.
Thank you. And really, just very briefly, Gustavo, what are your thoughts, on this particular question? I know that, again, sitting at where you are at UNESCO, you're very much at the sort of sharp end of some of these issues.
Yes, there are significant challenges all around us, poly-crisis, we all know about it, environmental, conflict, poverty, inequalities. And it's an approach that requires a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection, and I see a lot of value in the work the organizations convening the World Science Forum, the work we do, each organization individually. Change is incremental, and it's not as fast as we want, but we have to get there. So the relevance of this, to get awareness. For example, I learned a lot from, and got very worried what you were saying, Andres. But we have to make awareness. There was a film some years ago. I was just remembering. It was sort of not a spectacular movie called, I think it was called Don't Look Up. It was an imminent catastrophe to Earth. I think it was an asteroid or something. And, and everyone could see it, the calculations were there, and the film was saying, don't look up, because at some point you could see but people were engaged in discussions on a breakup of a TV couple or something. So it's very important to raise awareness, to change minds, to reflect on options and solutions, and to raise support and funding, which is needed, and to build alliances. So that's the way I see it. I mean, yes, there is, maybe the asteroid is there, but we really have to not despair on these efforts. And that's why actions like, say, the recommendation on the ethics of AI seems like a small piece. But when you get 194 countries to say, oh, we have to think of how to deal with the ethical aspects of AI, and we have to adjust our policy, an ecosystem or legal framework, that is something. It's incremental change, but it's something. So I think we should support this.
Inject a bit of optimism. And Professor Sir Peter Gluckman, you get the final word on this, and then we're going to invite members of the audience.
Well, as I said in the opening, one of the dangers we have is we evolve for short-term thinking and self-interest. And that's the nature of human evolution, our biological evolution. We need to recognize that we're now living with situations where collective interest across in groups and long-term thinking is critical for the trade-offs that need to be made. And I don't think we're very good at talking about the trade-offs honestly. You started this round of questions with the giant circuses of the COPs and so forth. There's so many voices in the room that there's no action. And I think one of the issues that I said at one of the sessions yesterday was the voice of science will be best heard when it's a singular loud voice of people singing the same tune. And too much of the science community over the last 30 years has been egotistical. It's my organization, or it's my organization, and we all make multiple conflicting or slightly different voices, which then you can't expect politicians to be scientific referees. And if they hear too many voices that are different, nothing happens. And so I continue to plead that whether it's on the government side of things or on the active scientific community side of things, we start to need to work better together as singular voices. It's the only way we'll make impact. And the last thing, and the other thing is we need to keep reminding every government in the world it's in their vested self-interest to work collectively on the global commons. That's the only thing that will drive a difference.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to walk over to back to the podium because I'm now at that age where I can't see things very well. And just really invite any questions. We have maybe just a little bit under 10 minutes. And there are hands going up. Yes, there is. I'd just like the lady there in the third row, in the scarf. Please tell us who you are and your question.
Good morning. My name is Rana Dajani. I'm a professor of molecular biology from Jordan. It was a great mapping of the landscape. However, from a transdisciplinary approach that was mentioned, I think what's missing, and I haven't heard about, is since science works for humanity and for future generations, there hasn't been mention of the family unit, who's taking care of the children, as a central point to solve a lot of the problems that were mentioned. And maybe the question is, how do we use scientific evidence to move from a material-based framework to a value-based framework going forward so that we can really work on achieving the goals of the Pact of the Future and others? Thank you.
And let's just take one more, and then I'm just going to see who'd like to take it. Maybe on the other side. Yes, the lady there in the black. Do you want to keep your hand raised? There we go. Thank you. Just tell us your name and...
Sure. Hi, good morning. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation. My name is Lisa Liao. I'm the former board governor and chairman of American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. From the discussion, I guess I wasn't hearing much about the public-private sector collaboration, especially involving major global companies. These global companies have huge amount of assets, capital, resources, technology. So it's very important to collaborate with them if we are to drive change. And related to that is financing for sustainability transition that will cost trillions of dollars globally. So what is the discussion with the financial institutions to get them on board on this mission? Thank you.
I'm just going to break my own rule now and invite maybe a couple more questions because the time is running out and you may not get this opportunity. So who else would like to ask a question? Yes, there's the gentleman in the second row there, and I think the lady at the back. Do you want to keep your hand raised? Yeah, good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Tibor Farago from Hungary. Let me turn to you. It was very interesting, your presentations. I am really grateful for that. But I really missed any reference to the so-called responsibility of science for the future generations. Sometimes we use the term, besides intra-generational equity, the intergenerational one. So how you see the responsibility of science and the representatives of science in general worldwide, how to explain, how to prepare, what kind of world, Earth, we will leave it for the future. I'm not about the extremes, but I think I missed especially that point from your presentations. I thank you.
Great stuff. And we need to do one more. Do you want to just keep your hand raised a bit higher? It's the lady on the left. There we go. Thank you. And just tell us your name.
Thanks for the session. My name is Amal Amin from Egypt, Egyptian scientist. Thanks for the presentations, but I would like to put the partnership, the 17th goal of SDGs in the core of the Sustainable Development Goals, not water, not energy, and so on, because it's time to have equally shared partnerships between all partners. Here in this forum, I didn't listen to any lecture about localization of the knowledge. We have it's time to have good multidisciplinary networks involving industry, scientists, and policymakers to work together, as the minister speak this morning. So that it's time for multidisciplinary networks. Also, we have to speak about what about science-based entrepreneurship. We didn't speak loudly about that. Even that science now, it's the only hope for developing countries. We here speak about the future, even we are stuck in the past, or in the present also we are delayed. So that it's time to speak about localization of knowledge or fair technology transfer, and also science-based entrepreneurship to benefit from the scientific outputs in real development. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. So we've got finance, partnerships, enterprise, the family, future generations, 30 seconds each. The clock is ticking. I think people want to get a cup of coffee for the next session. You're very welcome to, who'd like to have a go, or it's not, yep. And
I would just like to say, actually, in all these things that have been...
I'm counting the 30 seconds, by the way, go ahead.
That are being raised, reaffirms the theme that we had adopted as South Africa on science for social justice. Because these issues are at the heart of the current challenges we face and also caring about future generations.
Thank you so much. Jerry, yep.
Okay. Just on the future generations, I think to me a lot of that was probably silent because it's so embedded in the SDGs themselves, right? So how do we move ahead and ensuring that we're doing the best we can to contribute science to those objectives? I would also say, I mean, to several of the questions about, there is a lot of engagement. It is with the business sector, it is with local governments, it is with the research community. That's inherent in, and I think, all the work that we are doing now, the frameworks, the agendas that we put together, and I mentioned in my remarks, are very much about doing that. And we're putting some of that into practice. As one example, a global forum on technology, which is bringing us together people from civil society, from industry, from the research community to help us both get an idea as to what is happening with new technologies, opportunities for addressing SDGs and others, as well as some of the harms that we need to get a head start on trying to mitigate and ensuring that they work, I think, for families. And as we take into consideration, you saw my slides about empowering women and the lack thereof. I think this is also one of the impediments, right, is how are family responsibilities shared? We've been working a lot with across OECD, with those who are in our labor and social affairs groups, within our wellness groups, to understand both the challenges S&T can cause and how it can be a solution to some of these problems.
Thank you. Professor Andres?
Well, I would like to contribute to the discussion on the partnership, particularly in two regards. The role of the intergovernmental organizations and the role of the non-governmental organizations in science. Now, when it comes to the IGOs, the number one organization that comes to mind, of course, is UNESCO. The word science is there. Not only natural science and engineering, but also social sciences. So it integrates, in the German way of Wissenschaft, the two sides, which is in English, two different things. Perhaps I served in UNESCO for 25 years. That shows how powerful the organization is that they survived me. But one thing I have learned at the very beginning, and that was a shock. You know how much is UNESCO's regular budget that is voted for by the member states, the governments? Is less than a middle-sized US university. And that's a wonder that the organization is existing. And it is wonder what the organization has contributed to over its past almost 80 years of existence. So UNESCO needs to be strengthened, particularly today when all these terrible ideas are floating around and walls and idiot politicians, of course, not the science.
Professor Andres, let's hold that thought. So UNESCO needs to be strengthened. You've got UNESCO to your right. Gustavo, would you like to respond?
And also the NGOs, such as...
And the NGOs, yep.
Thank you. No, very, very briefly, and thank you for the words on UNESCO. I mean, two things. The topic of the World Science Forum today is the science policy interface, so that's key to the questions that were raised. And I will bring back to the words that ex-President Janos Adar was saying at the moment, measuring what we value. We really have to change how we look at well-being. And it's not just an issue of finding the measurements or the indexes or whatever, which is an important question, but also changing the outlook of what is important. It cannot be that science or scientific advance is without values or without ethic considerations, or it's looking, for instance, in the case of healthcare, where it's looking at diseases that affect the global north, but not those that affect millions in the global south because there is no market. So we have to change what we value, and that's key in these discussions with that element. Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Peter Gluckman, just to round us off.
I think we must be careful not to claim that science has all the answers. We must do that. And we must be clear that governments and multilateral organizations make their decisions on more than just science. But science is key to giving them the basic information of what we know and what we don't know. We must be more honest about what we don't know as well, so that they can make better choices. And it's better that we do this well, so we're trusted, rather than claiming that we have a technocratic answer to everything. I think it applies to all the questions that were asked. Values matter, societies matter, individuals matter. Science can help everybody make better decisions, but it cannot make the decisions for them.
Thank you so much. It's been illuminating. We are a little bit over time. I'm so grateful to all of our panelists, starting with the former president of Hungary, but also Professor Peter Gluckman, Baden Zmande, Jerry, Professor Andras, and Gustavo Marino. Please, can you give them a round of applause? You might have maybe 2 more minutes to grab a cup of coffee. I'm going to be in a session on Beyond GDP and how to measure sustainability, and if that interests you, please come and join us. We're on the 4th floor in, oops, can't really see this properly, Makovec room. I need to get some new glasses. Thank you so much.